Hi, it's Caitlin from the Ocean Tracking Network. In this course, Dr. Charles Bangley, Postdoctoral Fellow at Dalhousie University, will teach you how the goals of your telemetry project can inform your preparation, field deployment, and analysis. You'll learn how telemetry research can inform decisions that have significant social, ecological, and economic benefits through a series of case studies of telemetry research projects that have successfully informed fisheries management, shipping, and other human interactions with the marine environment. This course is part of an acoustic telemetry workshop series and includes examples that can help you along the way. If you'd like a copy of Charles's PowerPoint presentation, you can download it using the link in the description.
I am Chuck Bangley. I'm just getting started at Dalhousie as Postdoctoral Fellow. So we're going to be taking a step back from some of the stats and from the excellent overview of the analyses that Kim just gave, and talk about how decisions about are related to the animals and the type of analysis you want to do and the goals of your project actually influence not just how you set up your project, but also how the results of your project ultimately end up being used, and why it's good to have those things in mind. So things we'll cover are factoring the type of question that you're asking into your telemetry study, taking those results and applying them with a few examples, and then just a couple of case studies of telemetry results that have been applied to decision-making, or at least have produced results that kind of are ready-made to be applied to decision-making, even if they haven't necessarily been turned into policy quite yet. And most of this covers acoustic telemetry. One of the examples does involve satellite telemetry, and a lot of the things I'll talk about kind of transfer back and forth. So the first thing that you want to think of, and Kim touched on a lot of this as well, is the type of question that you're asking when you're setting up your telemetry project, because the type of question you're asking, it could end up influencing the entire workflow of your project. When we teach the scientific method in college, we oftentimes divide things up into descriptive questions and hypothesis-driven questions. And descriptive questions are basically the kind of, how does this work? What's going on here type of questions. In the context of a telemetry study, it could be how many individuals of your species of interest are actually present in the local environment, what kind of seasonal or environmental conditions are associated with them being present, and where the species goes when it's not present in the area that you're actually looking at in detail. More hypothesis-driven questions are things that are asking specific questions, like, are there differences in migration or seasonal presence by sex, size, subspecies, all that sort of thing? How your species of interest might interact with human uses of the water, like fisheries or building offshore infrastructure? And how will environmental changes affect the local presence of this species, both localized environmental changes, maybe from like a point source, or large-scale ones like climate change. So this generally leads you down two paths. When you're doing a descriptive study, which is kind of illustrated down here on the left, oftentimes you're deploying tags and receivers with the goal of just seeing what's out there. So you may not necessarily be targeting a specific area, or in some cases, depending on what you've got approvals to go out there and tag, you may just be trying to deploy tags on anything you catch. You're just trying to get that basic kind of ecological data from your study area. So the first thing you're going to be doing is deploying your tags and receivers. Then you're going to run some basic analysis of the things you find from those tag detections. Once you've run the basic analysis and you have a good idea of what your data structures and everything look like, then you can start applying questions. So you've got all this telemetry data. Now you can start looking at your data and seeing, is it a good data set for answering things like, what's the seasonal presence of the species, or is there a spawning aggregation going on here? And then once you've figured out the questions you want to ask from your data, then you can start applying question-specific analyses. On the more hypothesis-driven side, off to the right, you start out with your question as opposed to starting out with trying to gather your information. So this is, if you're thinking of the kind of traditional linear scientific method, you're at more of the informed hypothesis level here. You've already done some initial observations. So you think about your questions, you apply your questions to setting up your project, and then when you're deploying your tags or your receivers, you're deploying it with that specific question in mind. So you have a specific area you want to cover, you have a certain use of the area that you want to assess the interactions with, and everything that you set up at your project is informed by that. Then you conduct your analysis, which is inherently kind of question specific at that point. And then the endpoint for both is really ultimately answering your question in a way that can be implemented by the groups that are interested in the information you're putting out. Another way that these two processes can be bridged is that sometimes people go out there and they take down, they record telemetry data, or they develop these huge databases for their own projects, but they make them available. So in this case, sometimes you can take existing data sets that have been put out for a totally different purpose, or maybe even just the kind of information gathering basic data sets that are out there, and then apply your own questions to them and get started right there in the analysis step. This is where collaborative receiver networks like the OTN start to come in real handy. Again, this involves making sure that you're set up to collaborate with anybody who's owning those tags that you're going to be analyzing. But in some cases, if you just don't have the time or the resources to set up a large-scale telemetry project, this is kind of the dream. And oftentimes, between all the receivers that are out there in these networks, if you've got everybody involved, you can get these huge spatial areas that you can study as well. So getting into more specific effects of your type of question, so aside from affecting your entire workflow, it can also influence your deployment strategies. So for deploying transmitters, are you tagging everything, or are you just tagging every individual you can find of a particular species? Or are you trying a more targeted deployment strategy where you're looking at just males or females, or just juveniles or adults, that sort of thing, just individuals from a certain area that you primarily do your tagging? The same goes for receiver coverage. This is something you have to worry about less if you're dealing with satellite telemetry. But these two figures here illustrate kind of the two different extremes for how you plan receiver coverage. So this example back here from Heipel and Simfendorfer's work back in the early 2000s on juvenile blacktip sharks in Florida shows a really kind of even receiver coverage. And this is also similar to that array that Kim showed that was in the lake targeting pike, where the receivers are really deployed to maximize the spatial area covered and preferably even get some overlapping detection ranges, with the goal being that there's really nowhere these little sharks can go in Terracea Bay without getting picked up by these receivers. So this is more of a descriptive type of setup where you're deploying your receivers to try to cover everywhere you think your animal might be, in order to gather as much basic ecological data on them as you can. The other extreme is a much more recent paper. This is Rothermel et al. It just came out like last month. But the receivers that are these little circles surrounded by larger circles are set within these areas that are associated with U.S. Bureau of Ocean Energy Management wind farm lease sites. So in this case, the array is very specifically deployed to account for the use of these wind farm sites or potential wind farm sites by the species of interest. And in fact, in this southern wind farm lease that's off of Ocean City, Maryland, has some sites that are outside of the immediate wind farm site to assess whether or not the animals are passing inshore or offshore as well. So these receivers were very much deployed with a specific hypothesis in mind. They can also influence the choice of telemetry variables that you want to look at. Telemetry data can give you a huge variety of variables that you can work with. The most basic ones are presence, absence. Is the animal at the receiver or in your array or in your area of interest at all or not? And oftentimes this is summarized over periods of time, like daily presence or absence within a certain season. The fun part about presence absence data is that it can be used as presence absence records for habitat models, species distribution models, ecological niche models, whatever your preferred terminology for trying to look at the type of environmental preferences and predict where the animal is going to be. Traditionally, this has been observational data, or in the case of fish, kind of catch data have been used for this type of modeling. But presence-absence data from telemetry results can be used for it as well, as long as you keep the caveats in mind. You can also take certain measures of abundance using telemetry data in the form of the number of individuals detected in a particular area over a certain period of time. And abundance data can also be used in this type of habitat modeling. Other types of variables that you can look at might include residence time, or the time spent at a specific receiver or location. This can be used to identify site fidelity, or to even identify areas of potentially important habitat. Along the same lines, you can look at movement behavior. This is something that's really that's been traditionally done more for satellite telemetry, and that's the example that you see pictured here, looking at mako sharks in northern New Zealand, where different variables related to travel kind of between point A and point B at each point of your telemetry track can be used to describe different behavioral states. And this is where some of those state space modeling techniques that Kim was talking about come in. Typically, you end up in a situation where your animal is either making a really long beeline, just traveling over huge different distances really fast. And that's what's illustrated in this figure in the red dots. So this mako is just blasting its way across those deeper parts of the ocean there. And then where the dots kind of turn gray, those are areas where this particular individual kind of slows down, maybe shows a bit more turning behavior. So rather than traveling around in straight lines, this animal's maybe bouncing between receivers or telemetry hits a bit more. And that's typically indicative of more resonant behavior. And there are other variables that you can look at as well. And these can be used to designate different types of habitat, kind of classify habitat based on how the animal is using it. It is another way to assess whether habitat might be important or even essential habitat. And then there are then once you have your telemetry results, you have your data, you have your model results. I'm just going to run through a few different ways that you can actually take those variables and those results and inform and put them into the forms that can be used to inform policy decisions. So one of the things we talk about a lot is doing this kind of ecological niche / habitat modeling out of telemetry data. In this example by Danielle Halsey and colleagues in the Mid-Atlantic region, looking at sand tiger shark data, illustrates this pretty well. She took acoustic telemetry detections, matched them up with environmental data, and was able to basically get an idea of your likelihood of a sand tiger shark being in the area based on the environmental parameters. This is kind of the ultimate applied use of a habitat model that's kind of the goal when you set these things up initially. So what she was able to generate was basically a sand tiger shark forecast map, where it's basically a heat map where the red zones are the areas of your highest likelihood of running into a sand tiger shark if you were to, say, drop a line there or something. The literal metric would be your odds of picking one up if you had a receiver in the water, but it's basically a presence likelihood measurement. So this is the sort of data that can be used to designate important habitat. It can be used if you're looking at it from a United States fishery management standpoint. This is the sort of thing that's used to designate essential fish habitat, and can ultimately be used to designate protected areas. And if you have a temporal aspect to it, it can inform fishing seasons as well. This sort of modeling can also be really handy in documenting the full potential range extent for a species, or even looking at range shifts as ocean conditions change under climate change. You can also look at migratory routes and connections. This figure here is actually looking at Atlantic cod off of Newfoundland. So this is a local example for the OTN crowd. In this case, each of these dots are the percentage of fish that were originally tagged in this Smith Sound tagging area. This is the percentage of those fish that showed up on each of these arrays. And just by looking at the percentage of fish that appeared on each array, you can get a pretty good indication that most of them are maybe traveling out to the end of the peninsula, or maybe going around the top of the peninsula. You don't see any of them at all coming up and appearing in these really far northern arrays. And you also start to get an idea of the kind of southern extent as well. So this is the type of data that can be used to delineate stocks or subpopulations and get an idea of what the local fish population is like and how much fishing pressure it can take. I can also give you an idea of the dispersal of particular stocks and whether or not fish originating from different stocks might have areas where they overlap. So this southern area where 6% of the Smith Sound fish show up, there could be fish from a southern stock that are coming up and kind of meeting them here. So it can be used to identify these stock boundaries. And this can really help identify areas where conservation efforts like protected areas or fishery restrictions are needed, because this gives you an idea of, say, there's a particular population of a given species that's really been hard hit by overfishing. This gives you an idea of the full range extent, so you can apply your protections in that area while leaving maybe other stocks of that fish available for fishermen. Seasonal presence and abundance. This directly ties into things like fishing seasons and As we deal with larger species like Atlantic sturgeon and some of our whale species, this is increasingly influencing shipping traffic. In the Boston area, there are actually particular times of the year where shipping vessel traffic actually needs to have a speed limit imposed because your likelihood of incidentally colliding with a North Atlantic right whale is elevated. So this can designate fishing seasons, time area closures, all of that stuff. So this is actually very basic telemetry data. This is just, was that species there and what time of year was it there? And in this case, this is again that same array I showed earlier with those wind farm sites. It's showing the times of year that in this example, Atlantic sturgeon and striped bass are in those wind lease areas. This could potentially inform when construction might be able to take place for those wind farms in order to avoid disrupting the migrations of these species. And then there's also movement behavior. As I mentioned before, important habitats, whether they're foraging habitats or nursery habitats, tend to be areas where a highly migratory species in particular will slow down and start showing more of that turning behavior and lower velocities. So these, in this way, movement behavior can really help kind of shrink the haystack that you're looking for important habitat in. This example is a shameless plug for a paper that I'm an author on, looking at cow-nosed rays out of the Chesapeake Bay. And we can see that if you really look at these map figures, the dots that are in blue and purple are areas where the rays tend to slow down a little bit more. Blue is truly resonant behavior, where the rays are really just parked next to a receiver for a while. And then purple is more localized movement. They're kind of moving around across multiple receivers, but in the same tributary. And red, they're just blasting up and down the coast. And we can actually see both from this and from these latitude and longitude figures that there are very specific areas where these rays kind of stop and slow down, and they tend to be on the extreme northern and southern ends of their migratory routes. So this kind of helps narrow down the areas that might ultimately be important habitat for this species. Movement behavior, especially looking at it on very fine scales, can also help identify survivorship. There are archival tags that have been deployed on sharks and tunas and other species, where you can actually see from the movement behavior of the animal whether or not it swam off or landed on the bottom. And it can also look at sublethal effects of capture, like how long that particular animal that was released from maybe being caught, how long that animal's behavior kind of is indicative of abnormal or stressed behavior. So just a couple of examples of case studies. These are just a couple papers that I particularly like. The authors had no input in this whatsoever. I'm just a fan of what they've done here. So the first was looking at the problem in Delaware Bay of vessel strikes on a vulnerable population of Atlantic sturgeon. So there is a unique population segment of Atlantic sturgeon that spawns in the Delaware River and spends quite a bit of time within the Delaware Bay as a result. The Delaware Bay is very deep in the middle and very shallow to either sides of the main channel going through the middle of it. For that reason, and some of these shipping vessels that come in and out of like Philadelphia and places can take up almost the entire channel as they're going through. So there's quite a bit of vessel strikes on Atlantic sturgeon in this area. So to get a feel for where the highest risk of collision might be, Matthew Breese and colleagues out of University of Delaware and Delaware State looked at both presence and movement behavior. So this actually combines a couple of the metrics that I mentioned before. So looked at the presence likelihood in association with some environmental conditions, and also the movement behavior. So not just is the sturgeon there, but is the sturgeon passing very quickly through the area, or is it kind of lingering for a bit? And using these in combination, he was actually able to identify times of year and particular areas where sturgeon tend to linger and stick around and may inadvertently be more vulnerable to being run over by a boat. So in these particular maps here, especially in July and October, the blue coloration is more indicative of that resonant behavior. So in areas, particularly in the lower Delaware Bay and also along the kind of southwestern margin of the bay as well, these are areas where your sturgeon are much more likely to just kind of be hanging out on a mud bar or something like that, and may actually be more vulnerable to a vessel strike. So this is, again, the type of data that could be the first step in actually establishing policy. You could look at these maps and figure out areas that maybe need to have more restricted vessel traffic or where there maybe needs to be some speed limits imposed. And then sharks are always near and dear to my heart, so I had to have a shark example. So another example is not just sharks, but highly migratory species in general, like tunas and billfish. There's a lot of uncertainty around the effectiveness of various protected areas where fisheries are restricted for these animals. This is because these animals are really wide-ranging, so oftentimes the areas that are put in place to protect them only cover a small percentage of the full range of the animal. So there's a lot of interest in working out ways of judging just how protected, in this example, sharks are by these areas where fishing is restricted. So Kalick et al., this was using satellite telemetry, but we'll see in a couple of slides how this might also apply to acoustic telemetry. Modeled habitat suitability, which is habitat suitability model, another synonym for ecological niche model, whatever else you want to call it, at least in my mind. Don't come after me on Twitter about these distinctions, please. She and her colleagues modeled habitat suitability for 3 shark species, the great hammerhead, tiger, and bull. The great hammerhead in particular is of significant conservation concern because it's a large hammerhead that's shown really heavy population declines, using satellite telemetry positions with environmental data applied to them. And then she was able to take these mapped areas of protected areas where longline fishing in particular is restricted and see where the highly suitable habitat kind of fell within them during different seasons. So in this way, this actually provided a metric for assessing whether the sharks were in the protected areas at a given time of year. And in this was kind of the final output on the right here, where the areas highlighted in blue are areas where the sharks fall within these protected areas, and the areas in red are where they're not necessarily falling within the long line restricted areas. So that was a satellite telemetry example. Another shameless plug here for a paper that's not even really out yet. This paper's in press, but kind of inspired by some of these previous examples. Some colleagues of mine and I wanted to use a similar approach using acoustic telemetry data. And one of the nice things about being part of these networks or these telemetry networks is that you can get very satellite telemetry-like spatial coverage. And if you have a species like, in this example, the dusky shark, that tends to kind of hug the continental shelf, quite a bit of that species range actually falls within areas where there are acoustic receivers. So at some point soon, this paper's in press, you're going to be able to look at these pretty maps showing your likelihood of encountering a dusky shark. And we wanted to have the ultimate goal of assessing whether dusky shark encounter likelihood was falling within this protected area off North Carolina that was specifically put in place with dusky sharks in mind as one of the species it was protected. And also those same wind farm sites that are off of Delaware and Maryland. So some results here just showing the kind of fall and summer distribution that we were able to get by applying the same kind of habitat modeling approach that we saw with the satellite telemetry. So stay tuned on that one. I'm sure that I will be promoting that a lot when it finally hits press. And with that, that's pretty much all I have. If you have any questions, you can ask them right now, or you can come after me on Twitter at @SpineyTag.
Thanks for watching the Ocean Tracking Network on YouTube. If you enjoyed this presentation, there's a good chance you'll like some of the other videos in this series. Click on the link in the description below for the workshop playlist, where you can learn more about the R programming language and some R packages suitable for exploring and plotting acoustic telemetry data. Keep up to date with our latest videos by tapping the subscribe button or clicking over on this list to see more workshops in this series.